Hey guys, this is Matt for CGTouch.com, and in this, the third and final part of our Boss Tu-2 tutorial in Modo, we're going to be creating the screen object. Now we've got a lot to cover in this section, so let's get right into it. So I've loaded up scene 12 from where we left off, and I've gone into a left view to take a look at what we're going to model. Now if we follow the line of the screen object, you see that we've got this section here, then we've got this kind of slope in the middle, and then there's thin, or kind of short section here. So we've got these three bits, this short section, this bit in the middle, and this top part here. Now if I go into the top view, you'll see that this sloped section is actually following the curve of this tube. So we're going to have to figure out a way to create that. Now initially we're not going to worry about this curve here. We're going to create the main body of the screen object in these three sections and just make this go all the way across the object in a straight line. We're then going to add in some extra detail and use some of Modo's custom tools to push these verts up into this shape here. So let's get going. So I'm going to go back to the left view. I'm going to create us a new mesh item, which I will rename and call screen. Hit enter. I'll then come up to the basic tab, click on the cube tool, and we'll start drawing out our shape. Now what I'm going to do is drag out the entire length of this. So about there. So remember, you can drop the tool and then use these crosses on the top and the sides of it to push it into place. When you're happy, space to drop the tool, and we can't see it, so I'm going to flip it around with the F key. And if I go to polygon mode, you can select it like that. Now we need to create these three sections, so we need to add in two extra edges in here. So I'm going to use the loop slice tool. So I'm going to select the edge and hit Alt C. I'm going to set our count to 2 and right click to activate the tool in our viewport. Now with the mode set to free, we can come up to here, click on one of these arrows and just drag it into position. We want that one to be about there, so about 35 looks pretty good. This guy I'm going to bring to about there. This is only rough for the minute, but that looks pretty good to me. So I'm then going to grab this top edge here, W for the move tool, and pull this down into position. So something like that. And with that done, I'm then going to come up and hide the rest of our objects. I'm going to hide the main body, pedal top, bottom pan, boss logo. I'm going to keep the refs loaded up because we want to see those guys. But everything else I'm going to get rid of. I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, and we can add some width to our object. So I'm going to switch up to the top view, and you notice that we created all of these polygons, if I select them all, in the center line here. So it's 0 on the x-axis, so we're going to move those with the W key out to the side of the object. And then I'm going to hit X for polygon extrude, right click in the viewport, and drag this out to the other side. Now because this is quite a complicated object, we're going to be using symmetry so that we can work on one half of it and add in all of the detail. And then finally when we're done, we'll mirror it over to the other side. So remember that we want this to be exactly in the center on the x-axis. So I'm going to drop the polygon extrude tool, double click these polys here, and in the basic tab I'm going to come to center selected and X, and that will move it a tiny fraction just so it sits exactly in the center on the x-axis. What this allows us to do is come in and using the slice tool, which is Shift C, we can draw a line down the x-axis like that. Now this isn't exactly on the x-axis, so we actually want to do exactly the same as we just did. I'm going to go to vertex mode, lasso select with the middle mouse button all of these verts, and again we're going to center select it on the x-axis. You see they moved ever so slightly. So I'm going to go switch back to polygon mode, grab this entire right side, oops sorry, polygon mode, not edge mode, grab this entire right side, and I'm going to hit delete to get rid of it. So now what we're going to do is work on this side of the screen, and then when we're done we're going to mirror it over to fill in this section here. So I'm going to go back to perspective mode, and we can start adding in some bevels. Now we have a problem. Basically the bevels on this object are of different sizes. These edges here have some quite large bevels on, whereas these ones are a lot smaller. Now if we were to just go in and select all of these edges here, hit B for bevel, right click, kind of drag it out, you notice that although these aren't quite as large as I'd like them to be, down here we're almost at the bottom of the pedal. If I was to pull it much further, we'd start getting a lot of problems going on down there. So what's the solution to this? Well, there's a mode over here on the inset. We can set it to width, but that doesn't do anything. It just kind of changes how the edge bevel takes its value into account. So I'm going to switch that back to inset, and we're going to do this in two separate sections. So I'm going to undo the bevel a couple of times like that. I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, and what I'm going to do is just select these top edges here. So we're going to select these. I'm going to go to polygon mode by hitting 3. And I'm going to delete both of these polygons like that. Now if we switch back to edge mode, you'll notice that our edges are still selected, and this works in all of the modes. If I go to vertex mode now, you see that the verts we selected in the middle are still selected, so that's kind of a useful thing. You can switch between modes, either using the buttons up here or the 1, 2, 3 keys, and it will retain your selection. So I'm going to go to edges mode, and with just these 3 selected, I'm going to bevel them quite a large amount, so something like that. And I'm going to up the round level to 2. So we get these nice beveled edges here. In fact, I'm going to go to a left view quickly and just make sure that we're following that ref. And you see that that is roughly the same as that curve there. So that's what we want. Back to perspective mode, space to drop the tool, and I'm happy with those bevels. And then I'm going to come in and bevel these edges separately. So I'm going to select these 3 now, hit B for the bevel tool. I'm going to right click and pull out a smaller bevel. So something like that, so about 400 over here. Now, normally if this bevel was this small we wouldn't use a round level of 2, but remember we're actually going to have to come in and join up these polygons again. So just like using the bridge tool, which is actually how we're going to do it, we need the same number of edges in each of these loops. So I'm not going to alter the round level so that we make sure we have the same number of edges here as we do here. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. I'm going to select these edges, so I'm going to hit 1, shift click the other, and then hit the up arrow on my keyboard to select to the end. I'll then hold down shift and click this guy, shift, if I zoom in a bit, and then click this one, and then up arrow until all of our edges are selected. I'll then come to the polygon menu and hit the bridge tool, or you could come to the edge menu and hit the bridge tool. They're actually the same tool, they're just in both menus, as you can use them on edges or polygons. So I'm going to come to the polygon menu, click the bridge tool, and right click, and it's going to fill in that gap for us. And you notice that our bevel is joining up nicely. Essentially we've got this large one here that is shrinking down to join up with this bit, which is pretty much exactly what we want. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, and those are our bevels done. So before we go on any further, I'm going to come up and quickly save our scene. So file, save as, and I'm going to save this as 13 screen base shape, and hit enter to save it, and we can then start work on figuring out how to add in that curved tube. Now with any complicated object like this, it's always a great idea to have a plan before you start creating any polys. So we're going to take a quick look at the references and try and break down exactly what it is we're going to have to do. So I'm going to come up here into the top view. And so remember we're creating this tube straight for the minute, and then we're going to bend it up into place. So what exactly does this tube consist of? Well, the end is a sphere, essentially half of a sphere, and then you have this cylinder that runs out of it. So we have 2 elements there. We have to create half a sphere, then we have to somehow from that create the rest of the body, the rest of the cylinder. With that done, we then need to implement it or integrate it into this polygon here. Now clearly this is only 4 sides, and the chances of being able to integrate a sphere and a cylinder, that's pretty slim, so we're going to have to create some extra edges somewhere along the way as well. But now we have 3 definite tasks ahead of us. We can create the sphere, then the cylinder, and then we need to integrate it somehow. So with our plan firmly in mind, we can start creating some polygons. Before we create the sphere, I'm going to come down and click on New Item Mesh. I'm just going to create a temporary mesh. I'm not going to rename it, but we're going to be working in here. And then when we've created the sphere and the cylinder, we're going to cut everything from this layer and paste it into the screen mesh item. So with mesh selected, I'm going to come up to the basic tab and activate the sphere tool. I'm going to zoom into our reference. And what I'm going to do is drag out a sphere that roughly follows this reference here. So I'm going to click somewhere in the middle and pull it out our circle like that, and you can't see it because if I go to perspective mode it's currently below the object, so I'm going to pull that right up to the top, go back to our top view, and we can use this to position it. I mean, I'm not worried about the position for the minute because we're going to change that. I'm just trying to get the size right, and it looks as if 2 millimeters is about right, so we want it to be an exact circle. So it's going to be 2 millimeters on the X and the Z axis. You notice that the Y axis is currently 0. Well, there are a couple ways that we can change this. Obviously we want a sphere, we don't just want this circle here, so we've got to add an extra dimension to it, which is the Y dimension here. Now we could come in, select this and hit 2 millimeters, and that would get us our sphere. An alternate way is to go to the perspective mode, zoom in on our object a little bit, and you'll see that we have these green crosses in the middle. So we pulled out the red crosses, sorry, which is the x-axis, and the blue crosses, which is the z-axis. Now to pull out the y-axis, I'm going to grab one of these crosses in the middle and click and drag up. And you'll see that we create our sphere. Now we want this to have the same radius, so that's 2 millimeters, and when it's that, we can now move on to the other options. Now we've got sides and segments down here, and these basically just describe the detail on our created sphere. Sides is detail running around the sphere like that, and segments are the number of polygons making up the height of the sphere like that. Now 12 and 24 seems to be about right for what we want. We're getting a nice smooth sphere. So I'm going to hit space to drop our tool. And then I need to introduce you to one more thing quickly. If we zoom right in on this sphere, notice that we're not seeing any kind of blocky edges or anything like that. It's something that we'd expect when we got this close to our model. And the reason is that this is created as a subdivision surface model. This is done by default on some of the tools in Modo. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on it right now, but all you need to know really is that using the vertices that we've created for our sphere object, Modo is going in and creating a smoother, more detailed object around it. Now we don't actually want that for this, so I'm going to double click it in polygon mode and hit the tab key on my keyboard. You notice that when I did, if you hit tab a couple times, it jumps between being nice and smooth and slightly more blocky. So we want the blocky version for the minute, or at least blocky when you get very close in. And with that done, I'm going to deselect like that, and we can start moving it into position. Now our sphere and cylinder are going to be running this way along the x-axis of the model. And at the moment you'll notice that if we zoom in on the cylinder, it seems to be kind of pointing upwards. So we're going to rotate it. I'm going to double click it to select. Activate the rotate tool with E, hold down Control, and pull on the blue circle to rotate it 90 degrees, like that. And then remember, because we're mirroring the object, we only actually need one side of this sphere. So what I'm going to do is quickly grab two of these polygons. I'm going to hit the L key on my keyboard to grab the loop, and then I'm going to hit delete. And this leaves us with this full side here and this slightly shorter side. Now I'm going to delete this shorter side by double clicking and hitting delete. And this leaves us with half of this sphere here. Now, on this angle, we're going to embed this into this polygon here. So we actually only need half of it this way as well. So what I'm going to do is come in and I'm going to grab these polygons here and these polygons here, and I'm going to hit delete, and I'm going to grab these guys in the middle and hit delete, and then double click this bottom section and delete that as well. So what are we left with? Essentially a quarter of a sphere. So we've got this this section here. So we're going to go to the top view, and we're going to move it so that it rests in the middle of this polygon. So somewhere around there like that. And then what I'm going to do is bring it down slightly, come into a left view. I'm going to rotate it into place. So I'm going to pull it down on the y-axis. And what I'm looking for is for this vert here to be just at the top of that slope. So I'm going to pull that down a little bit further. So about there, looks pretty close to me. Now we need to rotate this into view, but at the moment if I select the rotate tool, the center of the gimbal or gizmo is in here. It's not down here where we want it, because this is the point that we want to rotate around. Now remember, in our first part I said that you could right click in the viewport and set your action center as long as it was set to automatic. So I'm going to come up here and click automatic, and with that done I'm going to zoom in on this vert down here, get as close as I can, then right click right above it like that. So what has this done? This has moved our rotate gimbal right on top of that vert here. So now when we rotate, we're rotating around that bottom vert. So what I'm going to do is rotate this into position. So let's have a look. That looks pretty good to me. So what I'm looking for is for this line to line up, something like that. Yep, that looks pretty close to me, so I'm going to go back to perspective mode. I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. Now, we've created the sphere, so now we need to create the rest of the tube. So we're going to create the cylinder running off of this, and we can do this a couple of ways. But the quickest way would be to use the existing geometry. If we zoom in, you'll see that we've got these edges running around here. So I'm going to select 2 and hit the up arrow until we get down to there. And what we could do is hit the Z key on my keyboard, right click the edge extend tool, and pull these guys right out. You see that creates the body of the tube, so we didn't have to come up here and select the cylinder tool and create another cylinder and then join them up. I'm using the existing geometry I created and extending the edges out. So we want these guys to be right on the x-axis, so I'm going to bring them pretty close, then hit space to drop the tool. I'm going to come up to the basic tab, center selected, and click X. And that pulls them right into the very center. And with that, we're ready to start integrating it. Now the method that we're going to use to integrate the sphere and tube object into the main body of the screen is the same one that I used when I first created this object, and by no means is it the easiest and cleanest way of doing this. In fact, it gives us a couple things that we're going to have to clean up after we do it, and it makes things a little bit tricky in places. But I figured as these are things that you might come across when you're modeling your own models, I should leave them in instead of creating the most perfect way of doing this and integrating these two objects together and kind of giving you no problems to deal with at all. I figured we'd run through those together. So what I'm going to do is come up and select the screen object and delete these bottom 3 polys. Get rid of those and we can add them back in later. And then I'm going to add in this edge. So I want to add in an edge to the screen object that matches this edge on this tube. So I'm going to come into the top view, Shift C for the slice tool, and just drag an edge down like that. Now you notice I didn't get it exactly right, so I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, double click that edge loop, W for move, and just move it roughly into position. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be hugely accurate, but you know, the closer the better. So with that done, we're going to do the same thing again twice more. So I'm going to do that along this edge here. So I'm going to try and equally space these slices down that edge. So again, Shift C for the slice tool and drag out 2 extra edges, and then we can just go in, double click an edge loop and move it roughly into position if we want. As I said, this is only kind of rough, so don't worry about getting it too close. But you know, the more evenly spaced the better. It's always good to have good poly flow. So with that done, I can come to perspective mode, and we're going to grab these 4 polygons here and just delete them. So get rid of those guys. Now we have a hole in our screen object. We can bring this mesh layer into this guy. So I'm going to come down and click the mesh items list, double click this polygon group, Control X to cut, come up to the screen mesh object and hit Control V to paste. We can then go to the mesh item, right click and hit delete to get rid of it. I'm going to reactivate our screen layer by clicking on it. Then we can start adding in some polygons. So what I'm going to do is go to edge mode, select these 2 edges, these 2 edges, and these 2 edges, and these 2 edges. So we've got 4 there and 4 there. And then I'm going to use our trusty bridge tool and right click to create those polygons like that. And then come down and do the same on the other side. Now just to show that they can be selected in any order, I'm going to select the 4 on one side first and then the 4 on the other side. Select the bridge tool, right click, and you see it creates the polys as expected. So space to drop the tool. Now we need to fill in this hole here. Now if you look at this bit, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 edges, and here we only have 1 to connect to. So clearly we need to add in 5 extra edges here. So I'm going to grab one of these edges, Alt C for the loop slice tool, and with a count of 5 I'm going to right click to create 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 edges to connect to. So I'm going to space to drop the tool and select these guys. I'm going to hit 2 and hit the up arrow on my keyboard to select the rest, and do the same here. So select 2, up arrow to select the rest, come up to the bridge tool and right click. By this time you should get pretty used to the bridge tool. And you see we've now integrated both these objects together. So if I was to double click this base layer, this part becomes selected as well. Now all this time I've been kind of talking about how adding in an extra kind of group of polys, an extra ring of polys around a corner like this is a good way to remove any smoothing errors or something like that. So that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to come to the end over here, activate the slice tool, sorry, the edge slice tool with C, and we're just going to do this manually. Now, don't worry about trying to get this too precise so that everything is perfectly straight and kind of evenly spaced apart. It's not hugely vital. You know, it's always great to have a nice clear mesh and, you know, a good layout, but don't particularly worry about it too much. Now you notice that sometimes I accidentally don't hit an edge. I click in the middle of a polygon like that. And that's allowed. You can click there and then click off to an edge. Modo does allow you to do that. But if you don't want to do it, like now I don't need this extra vertice in the middle here, I'm going to undo twice and then come back and add in that edge again. So it does allow you to undo individual cuts like that, which is very handy. So I'm going to keep adding these in. Keep going around. And one more. Come to the end. And put that like so. So space to drop the tool, we've added in the extra ring of polygons around this. So we've now integrated both of these objects together. What is the next stage? Well, if we go to the top view, we have two more things to do really. One is to create this button object which goes through a hole in this screen mesh. And the second thing is obviously to curve this tube up into position so that it follows a reference. And that's the thing that we're going to do first. But before we start doing that, I'm going to come up and save our scene. So save as, and come down to 14, and we're going to call this screen integrated. Hit off, and we can start thinking about how to bend this up into position. Now before we even begin to think about moving these up into position, we're going to have to add in some extra detail, because right now we've just got these edges over here, and then a big gap in the middle, and then these edges over on the left hand side. So I'm going to grab one of these middle edges, I'm going to hit Alt-C for the loop slice tool, and right click. With a count of 5 we're adding in 5 extra edges, but if we were to move these up into position now, this curve would still be far too blocky, so we're going to have to add in even more edges than this. Now I'm going to come over to where it says count in the loop slice options, and up that to about, say, 32. So that gives us a whole bunch more edges to work with. Now if I zoom in, I can kind of explain really. I mean 32 is just an arbitrary number. We can change it to 36, you know, 35, whatever you want. Essentially I'm just trying to make this so there's enough detail in this tube object so that when we curve this up in a second, it's not going to look blocky at all. This is an area of the model that's likely to be featured in close-up renders, so we don't want any blockiness showing if we can help it. Setting this high does up the poly count quite considerably, but when this is all shaped correctly, we're going to go in and try and fix that a little bit. Now for the next bit of this tutorial, we're not going to necessarily specifically have to have this at 36. If you think it looks better at 34, feel free. It's not going to make any difference to the tutorial. So with 36, I think that looks okay, so I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. Now as with everything in 3D modeling, there are a couple ways we can do this. One way that is clearly insane and that is just going to take you a couple of days and you're not going to want to do it is to come in and grab some verts and just start moving them up to position. Then grab the next ones and do the same thing, and that is just going to take an awfully long time and you're not going to necessarily get it exactly precise at the end of the day, so there must be a couple of better ways of doing this, and of course, this being Modo, there are. So I'm going to undo those guys a couple of times like that and deselect by clicking off. Now the first way that I thought I would do this is to come in and select all of these verts. So in vert mode I'm just going to lasso select around all of these guys, so I'm going to miss out these end ones, and then I'm going to come up to the fall off and click on linear. Now we've used the linear fall off before, but we're going to use it a little bit differently here. But remember you have to drag it out first, so I'm going to click and hold just above this left hand vert and then drag out to the right and end just past this last one there. So something like that. And then I'm going to release the mouse and activate the move tool with the W key and then start moving these up into position. And remember at the big end of the fall off we get 100% of what you're doing to these verts, and at the small end we get 0% of what we're doing. So these guys at this end haven't moved at all. But you'll notice with the linear fall off it is, as you'd expect, linear. There is just a straight line in between them and not getting this curve at all. But if you come down and look in the linear fall off options, you'll see that we've got something called shape preset. At the moment it's set to linear, which is giving us this straight kind of transition from 0% to 100%. However, if we were to change this, so click on it and change it to say ease in, look what happens. We get this curve here, but look at the shape of the fall off itself. You can see this purple pinkish line. It's now slightly curved. If you watch that quickly and I switch back to linear, so watch the line. So it's gone perfectly straight. So we're getting a straight line there, which is giving us a straight transition. If I change it to ease in, we're getting it slightly curving out towards the end. So we get kind of like a bigger end here, which is giving us this curve. And there's other options as well. So ease out, if you watch the fall off, it's thinner for a lot longer. So we're getting a lot less movement on these verts, and then suddenly it ramps up to 100% at the end. So what we want is ease in. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, come up to the fall off and click none. Now, if we go in and have a look at what we've got, you'll see that this end, although it's not exactly following the ref, looks pretty good. It's pretty smooth here and everything's looking as it should. But notice as we come towards this end, this sphere section is completely warped. It doesn't look like a sphere at all anymore. If I come into perspective view and zoom in around that, you'll see it's just completely stretched, and to go in and have to fix that is going to take an awfully long time. It's possible, and you know, if you had an hour to spare you could probably do this, but for the sake of the tutorial and to give you guys a better idea of how to do this, I'm going to undo that a couple times. So Control Z until it's back to like that. So we're not going to be using the fall off for this, but notice as I've undone, the linear fall off is now selected again. So I'm going to come up to fall off and click none. So we've got no fall off selected. I'm going to click off these verts to deselect them. So how are we actually going to do this? Well, we're going to use a tool in the deform menu called bend. And to do that, I'm going to grab the verts that we had selected a moment ago. So I'm going to middle mouse lasso around all of these guys, so missing these end section. And then I'm going to come up to the deform menu and click on the bend tool. Now the bend tool is activated by right clicking in the viewport, and wherever you right click becomes the center of the bend, and that will become clear in a second. But for now I just want you guys to right click on this vert here. So I'm going to right click. You see we get this blue handle. Now this is not anything to do with the z-axis. This is the bend modifier handle. We can grab this to start the bend. So what I'm going to do is hover over it, click and drag to the left. And when we do that, you'll notice that all of our selection starts to bend around that point. If we let go and then click and drag to the right, it starts to bend the other way. So we obviously want to drag to the left a little bit. I'm just going to match that curve as best as I can. So something like that looks pretty good. Then I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. Now, a couple things to check. First of all, with the fall off, the end of our sphere got completely warped and it looked horrible. With the bend tool, however, you'll notice that things are looking pretty much as we left them. It's pretty much still a sphere, it's just bending up slightly into this curve. However, it does give us, as I'm sure you've noticed, a bunch of problems with these verts here. We've got this kind of vertex here that's just flying out towards the edge of the screen there. So we're going to have to fix up some things in a minute to do with that. The other thing, if I go into the top view, you notice that even though this tube before we bent it was as long as it was in the reference, now that it's bent it's actually a little bit shorter. So we're going to have to scale it out before we bend it down. And then the third thing is obviously we're going to have to move it up to match the reference image. So I'm going to hit undo a couple times until we get back to these guys being straight. Now the first thing that I'm going to do, which is the simplest of them all, is I'm going to move this up into position. So I'm going to hit the W key for the move tool and move this up until the edges of these verts match the kind of center line of that tube on the reference. So something about -10 millimeters, that's kind of a handy figure. So something like that looks good. Now remember, we also had to scale these out because when we bent it down it became shorter than it was in the reference image. So I'm going to activate the scale tool with the R key, and then going to come in and set our scale tool center by right clicking on this vert here. So get it as close as you can and right click, and the scale gizmo jumps to that vert. And we're then going to pull it out on the x-axis. And how far do we have to pull this out exactly? Well, to be honest, it's just a bit of trial and error. If you don't get it right the first time, you might have to undo and come back and try it again. But 107.5 is the figure that I'm going to try. So with that done, I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, and we can then activate the bend tool. So I'm going to come up and right click on that vert so we get our bend handle. So I want to get this as close as we can, and then right click. Then with our bend handle in the viewport, I'm going to click and drag left on it. And you'll notice two things. One, it's matching the ref quite closely, but two, it's not quite long enough. So what I'm going to do is hit space to drop the bend tool, Control Z to get back to there, and we're going to scale these guys out a little bit more. So I'm going to activate the scale tool again. We have to right click to set it center, so on this vert here. Then we're going to drag out a little bit more on the x-axis. So we did 1.7.5, sorry, 107.5, and now doing 102.5. And then I'm going to activate the bend tool again. Come up and right click on that vert to give us our bend handle. And then click and drag to the left. And we match our reference image much more closely. Now obviously you guys can spend a bit more time to get this exact, but for now I'm just going to call that pretty much good and get that done. So you might want to add an extra percentage on that scale maybe. But I'm just going to rotate this round until it matches the reference as closely as possible. So about -34 looks good. I'm going to hit space to drop the tool and go to perspective mode to see what we've got. So with this moved up and bent, you can see that everything is looking pretty good, especially this section here. At the end, we've got a couple of things going on that we're going to have to clear up, and we'll move on to doing that now. Before we do, I'm going to quickly come up and save our scene. So save as, I'm going to save that as 15, tube, bent into shape, and hit save. And then we can go in and take a look at what's wrong. Well, there's a couple of things, and to be honest, this is pretty close to the end result. These next couple of things are just tweaks to make it as close as possible to the actual model, which is what we want. So it's always worthwhile looking out for these little things. Now, if I go into the top view, you'll see that the, I'm just going to hide our refs actually, just for a second. So I'm going to click the eye next to the refs group. You'll see that we've got this curve that is the top of this tube and the curve which is the bottom of this tube. And if you follow this down to the side of the pedal, it suddenly comes down and then straight out. Ideally what we want is for this curve to continue down right to the edge of the pedal. The same is true for down here, except slightly less. This is curving down, and when it gets to this point, it slightly evens out and then comes straight out towards the edge. So what we're going to do is get these verts, and we're going to kind of tweak these into position. And to start off with, we're just going to move them up. So I'm going to hit the move tool, which is W, move these up into position like that. Now what I'm looking for is for this curve to continue round here to this point. So we want to get this as close as we can, so something like that looks pretty good. I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, and we're going to tweak these two verts. Now why are we going to tweak these two? These seem to follow the curve quite nicely, and it's all about evenly spacing. Remember when we added in those first 3 cuts, we wanted to try and keep as even spaced as possible, to keep a good poly flow and to kind of reduce any smoothing errors we might have.